So I'm going to rant. So there is a common question. It's actually one of the shorts that I made early on with the help of 60-Second Skeptic. There is a common question that I get asked, and I see people ask other people, that is very intellectually dishonest. It shows their lack of knowledge, shows their lack of even looking into the topic. And then when you provide them with the answer, they act like you're wrong. Now, this topic is a heavily debated one. What they ask us is, well, how does something come from nothing, right? And that's literally just a mirror of their position, because they don't understand anything, and they're posing that a god created everything out of nothing, right? And so this is just a mirror of their very intellectually dishonest position, because they don't actually think something can come from nothing. That's why they say God did it, because they think that something has to come from something, right? Just like we see in reality, something comes from something, right? It arises from something. It transforms, it changes shapes, whatever, right? But what we see here when they ask this question is their lack of understanding of anything to do with reality, and then a special plea because, well, if everything came from something, then the God must have come from something, right? Well, they say, no, it's a necessary being. Well, this is special pleading for a necessary being, right? And most of those guys that ask you, how does something come from nothing, don't actually understand any of this conversation. Now, you could even just point out to them, which they won't understand, that there is the tiny, tiny likelihood that something comes from nothing, in that there would be no laws of physics, no laws of logic, nothing to stop something as simple as pure energy from popping into existence, right? Like a field, or just pure energy, or whatever the case may be, right? There's nothing to stop that. Now, that is probably not the case, right? I claim a necessary being myself, but it's not special pleading in my case, because I'm not claiming some abstract entity disconnected from reality, right? We have evidence of quantum fields, and whatever the fundamental substrate of the universe is going to be the necessary being. And it's going to provide a complete and sufficient explanation for everything in the universe. The God can't do that. They can't make predictions with the God. They can't calculate from the God. Nothing like that. It's nonsense. It's totally bogus. These people are simply shooting from the hip. Pew, pew, pew. Pew, pew. Asking the dumbass question, how does something come from nothing? I used to just link them that short, right? Because I thought that was a funny way of addressing it. But it's not enough. They tell me you don't even address it. Well, the reason they ask that question is because they haven't studied science or philosophy, and they're intellectually ignorant and lazy. They don't care about what's true. They're just strawmanning your position to give you a headache and make you do work and take the easy way out. They don't actually want to deal with the topic. They don't care about the truth. All they're trying to do is obfuscate and prevaricate and disengage, because they can't actually address any of the points. Because if they were to simply take the time to look into the sciences, they would understand that something arises from something, and the Big Bang is rapid expansion of pre-existing stuff. Whoa! Do you see how that question is incredibly dishonest and shows their lack of intellectual integrity? They did not spend any of the time on the back end to prepare for this conversation, and they're intellectually impoverished. The only way to deal with somebody like that is to point out to them that the Big Bang is something coming from something. Something arising through transformative processes into another form. That's all that happens with the energy that exists. It doesn't go anywhere. It didn't come from anywhere. It would have necessarily always had to have existed, at least in my view. But even though something arising from something seems much more intuitive and viable and logically coherent, there is still the logical possibility, given that there's no laws of logic, no laws of physics, nothing at all. It's true absolute nothingness. There would be nothing preventing something as simple as pure energy from popping into existence. Now, I don't think that's the case, and most people don't either, because it does go against intuition. But that is still a possibility that they're automatically discluding. And so when you actually explain to them the view that some people hold, they can't understand it. They're too confused and lost to actually deal with it or try to understand it. They start asking all sorts of crazy questions, right? But the point is, regardless of whether you look at something arising from nothing, which I'm granting, like, for the sake of conversation, 0.00000000001% likelihood, right? Which I feel like is probably more than it would actually be if we had some way to calculate that likelihood, which we don't. But the point is, we have explanations on the something arising from something. We have a logical possibility of something arising from nothing. And we have explanations all the way through from that fundamental substrate to today. So I don't really know how to engage, because there's a certain level, a certain point where you have to acknowledge the level of intellectual dishonesty that's being displayed, because nobody in the sciences says that it comes from a true nothing. In the sciences, they're referring to a quantum void or quantum field of some form or something like that. Some type of fundamental energy substrate. This has nothing at all to do with the philosophical nothing. Although I did provide an example of that. Now, the problem is, once you explain these to somebody that's asked you, begun the question, how does something come from nothing? Once you give them an actual way that something could come from nothing and a much more reasonable alternative, which seems to be the case, at least in my opinion, and has evidence of both the philosophical and scientific variety, they say, but no, God. Or they act like they don't understand what you're telling them. And they probably have their rose-tinted glasses filtering the words that are coming to their brain. I haven't been able to figure this one out. I've been working on it. I still run into these people. I don't know. I have a hard time with the intellectual dishonesty, right? I'm kind of kooky about people being dishonest with me, and I get very upset when people are dishonest and lying to my face, right? And so when I go through something like that explanation I just gave you on both sides, and a theist is responding to me pretending to not understand or give me objections to those, which is insane, giving objections to those, because you're like pointing to the state of affairs and saying there's a fundamental state, and they're saying that can't be the case. Are you insane? And on top of that, you give them a logically possible alternative where something could arise from nothing, and they scoff at you. They're like, no, that's how God came into existence. That can't be the case. Or they're like, no, that can't be the case because God had to make everything because something has to arise from something. And you're like, no, your God's literally creating stuff out of nothing. So the God is doing creation ex nihilo, and they're like, no, the God's not creating everything out of nothing. It's creating it out of stuff. Well, what stuff? Well, you've got two options, right? So if they say that the God didn't create everything out of nothing, creation ex nihilo, then the God would have had to create everything out of itself or some type of pre-existing energy substrate. I guess there could be a brute fact with a pre-existing energy substrate, and then they're kind of tacking on like a god to that for some reason. But let's just grant that, right? Because the pre-existing energy substrate portion is at least possible. That's a brute fact, right? No explanation for its existence. So let's just say that a god's a brute fact with that for the example of this hypothetical, right? Now, the reason that I present a necessary being position is because I think that's more likely. I think that there is a state of affairs which has to necessarily be the case for anything to exist at all. And that thing, that stuff, is the fundamental state of the universe, which I call the universal quantum field. This necessary being position, I think, is well grounded. I've got argumentation for it on the philosophical side. A fundamental state of energy is supported by the sciences. And so it's got both philosophical and scientific evidence supporting the position. What you're going to see them do, though, is they're going to say that the God creates everything out of itself or a secondary fundamental substance. And just a fundamental substance out of necessity is a much more parsimonious answer right there. And so I think that alone should be enough to show. But if they're claiming a brute fact God, they could pretty much claim whatever, because if it has no explanation for its existence, pretty much anything goes, right? That's not really a good one, right? Right. It's not great, but I'd place that one kind of at the same likelihood, except just for the energy substrate, not a God thing. That seems unnecessary. But the energy substrate, right? I'd place that about the same likelihood as a something coming from nothing, to be honest with you, or even infinite regress is much more likely than like a brute fact, right? Because it could just be energy looping forever, right? But with that being said, I do believe that a necessary existence is likely the case. But you can have this whole conversation with somebody presenting these options. They're literally going to say that the God made everything out of its essence or something like that, right? Which means we're all God. Or everything is God, right? Or the God made it out of some fundamental substrate, which kind of invalidates the God, because the universe could just expand on its own if there's a fundamental substrate existing with it, and there's much more parsimonious options. I appreciate y'all watching. I wanted to do a follow-up of that short that I did when I first started the minute of how does everything come from nothing, right? I wanted to do a follow-up for that with some more information, because I still continue to have that question asked to me, and it becomes more and more frustrating to deal with. And so I wanted to talk about that with y'all, because I'm sure y'all are having the same issue there. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. Please make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. And we'll see you soon.
Get wrecked, nerd. Got fucking dominated, dude.
Absolutely dominated.